Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal, and together with the producer, Landry Bone, we bring a guest to you every month. And this month, I'm very, very happy to have with us a colleague and a friend. His name is Stephen Estopinal. Hey, Steve.
Well, how you doing, Sandy?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for asking. It's a beautiful day here in New Orleans. Not too hot yet.
Yeah, well, it's kind of cool up here in Gonzales, but in New Orleans, yeah, it's not too hot.
No, it's just beautiful, and we're enjoying every cool day for, as long as we can, because you know it's going to turn hot again. There is the old saying, "Winter is coming," but here it's summer is coming. Okay, well, you know what? In New Orleans, you're an extremely well-known name, but a lot of our listeners are outside of the city of New Orleans, and so I'm just going to tell them a little bit about you, and then we'll get started. Okay?
Sure.
All righty. Stephen Estopinal is a retired registered professional engineer since 1975 and a registered professional land surveyor since 76. He was the owner of Estopinal Surveying and Engineering in Chalmette, Louisiana, and practiced land surveying and civil engineering for over 50 years in Louisiana. He was appointed as a commissioner in the Southwest Louisiana Flood. I'm starting again, Landry. He was appointed as a commissioner on the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East on Halloween Day, 2008, and served from 2008 to 2016. That flood authority is now called the East Flood Authority because that other one was a mouthful. Steve was president of that organization in 2014. Now, Mr. Stopinall is a novelist, and his books include, among many, Escape to New Orleans, which I have read and I highly recommend. This is actually my second time inviting you onto my show.
Well, yes, ma'am, it is.
The first time we discussed, it was really a fascinating conversation. We talked about how narratives, once they get into people's heads, are very difficult to change. And in your particular case, we were discussing how people had very, very wrong ideas about the Spanish. Maybe you can help me a little out here, what we
Well,
talked about?
the Spanish period during Louisiana was 40 something years, and it was 40 years of great advancement and improvement in Louisiana. The economics improved greatly, and then, of course, Spain assisted the United States in the American Revolution in a very big way. Galvez led his armies to run the British out of Baton Rouge and Mobile and Pensacola, put them off the Gulf Coast, sent his armies up the river, and prevented the British from coming down the Mississippi River to cut off the colonists and essentially protected the United States on its western and southern borders. So it was a big deal. And history books don't talk a lot about that, and they really
Right.
should.
Right, and and we probably we have so much to get into today on what we're going to discuss today. But it was about the challenges that you face when people get the wrong ideas in their heads, and it's difficult to dislodge them.
Yes, sometimes you just can't do it.
And sometimes,
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's in there, it's set so hard that even when the evidence is overwhelming, they still stick to the old beliefs that they've got crammed into their heads.
well, we'll be talking on something very similar today, except that belief is only 20 years old and not from such a long time ago. And that is, we'll be talking about what we're often referred to as levee board reform in New Orleans after the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina. So Steve, why don't you tell our listeners about your role after Hurricane Katrina and your work as a commissioner on the Flood Authority East?
Well, Hurricane Katrina wiped out my business. It wiped out because I was centralized in St. Bernard Parish, and St. Bernard Parish was totally devastated. I had no clients. Without clients, you can't have a business. So I had to take a job in Baton Rouge with another engineering company. And while I was there, the legislature formed this commission. And instead of putting political appointees on the levee board, they decided they were going to put people that had expertise and experience in the sciences involved with flood protection or the sciences involved with handling money in big businesses. And they wrote a very good law, and they appointed people, and I put my hat in the ring, and I was appointed as a commissioner to replace one of the other commissioners who was going off the board. And my expertise had to do with the very unusual geology of St. Bernard and Orleans and South Louisiana, because as a land surveyor, I spent my 50 years measuring the changes in elevation and the disruptions that were taking place in the deltaic regions. And then also because of my expertise in land surveying, levees are built on land that's acquired from private persons, so you really have to have an expertise in land surveying so that those transactions are forward, recoverable, recognizable, and legal. And so those were the expertise that I brought to the board. And that's why I was put on the commission.
And what did you find out during your 8 years of serving as commissioner and at least two of them as president?
Well, the first thing I found out was that the Corps of Engineers is fairly incompetent. I know it sounds like a hard thing to say, but the very first meeting I attended, they presented a survey for the acquisition of the land that they were going to build these big floodgates on. I don't know, $1.2 billion worth of expenditures. I forgot what the number is. They use silly numbers like that because it's just so much involved. And the survey what they contended as a survey plat, what they presented was an absolute amateur attempt. It failed in every way. And of course, my head came off and I was very critical of it, but it didn't matter because it was a done deal. And so I said, well, we'll get them doing a better job. We'll make sure they hire professional surveyors. So when they do these property acquisitions, they do them in a proper way so that it's documented and everybody has confidence in where the boundaries are. And so then the next thing they came in with was the proposed design for the T-wall. And many members on the board, not just me, recognize the problem.
Steve, if I may, can you briefly tell our listeners what a T-wall is?
Okay, a T-wall is a structure that is very frequently used to extend the height of a levee or provide a barrier to water it's like an upside down T. The long, narrow part is what keeps the water out, and the T part of the bottom is what keeps it from flipping over.
Thank you.
Then, yeah, but
I know now, but most people don't.
Well, then the first thing that we on the board recognize that a T-wall on top of a levee, once that levee subsides, and it's going to fall at a different rate than the T-wall is because the T-wall is sitting on pilings, you're going to have difficulty keeping the mud up underneath the T. It's virtually impossible to properly maintain it. So we complained about that. We said you need to adjust your design so that you're able to maintain the soil below the T-wall. And it might not be a perfect T. It might be some other kind of design. And we had some suggestions. And they said, oh, yeah, we'll take it in consideration and we'll get back to you. And I remember saying, do you promise you'll get back to me? Oh, yes, we'll get back. Well, of course, they never did. And, of course, it was a T-wall. And it's going to be very hard to maintain. And I think if you talk to the commissioners today or the field personnel today, one of the big problems they have is the soil is falling away from underneath the T-wall, as we said it would.
And am I correct, Steve, that once you've built a T-wall, you cannot raise the height?
No, it's fixed. The T-wall is fixed on pilings, yep. So you can't get there with a big jack and jack it up. You got to do something else, but that's another issue.
Okay,
they're wrong when they're 50 years from when it was built, which by the way is only now 25 years from now. Mm-hmm. I may not live to see it, but you might. They're going to have to raise that T-wall, and they're not going to be able to do it very efficiently. I'd like to see the design they come up with for that. Then they decided that they were going to use steel piles, of course, in these T-walls. Very fine. Interlocking steel piles, great idea. But then, of course, they didn't want to have treated piles because it would take too long to get treated piles. So they were going to use raw steel in a marine environment. Now, you can get 500 engineers and ask them, can you use raw steel in a marine environment for a permanent structure? And you will get 499 say, no way you can. And you will get one that's committed to an insane asylum somewhere. It is absolutely unbelievable that they did that. And they said, well, we're going to compensate for the fact that it's not treated by making the T-wall thicker so that it'll last the 50-year lifespan of the T-wall. So now you have a T-wall that you can't raise when it needs to get higher. And in 50 years, you have a chance of the T-wall rotting away underneath, particularly since you can't keep the soil up against the sheet piling because it's covered by that T-wall and it's not conducive to putting material back in there.
And another thing, Steve, that thicker means more steel.
Oh, yes.
And steel's expensive.
Well, it seemed like the thing that was driving the Corps was time.
Uh-huh.
If it was anything that was going to delay the completion of it, they skipped over it.
Expense be damned.
Expense be damned, and they took shortcuts every place they could. And that was one of the, in my opinion, inexcusable shortcuts. One of the other members on the board, Stafford Goings, I believe I'm saying his name correct, Stafford, didn't know him for a long time, but I tell you what, I was very impressed with him. And he really criticized the design models for the storms that they used to design it. And he complained about they weren't using the right design storm, they weren't coming from the right direction, and they absolutely just ignored anything he said. Matter of fact, I think he resigned from the board because of that. You'll have to ask Stafford that.
That is correct.
Correct. So that was another, and so I'm on this board, and we got a board of experts, and I tell you what, everybody on that board was a real good expert at something. I mean, these were guys that were pretty sharp, and every one of them, they might as well have been bankers. I mean, it didn't matter. And because they were doing this, it was very frustrating.
Could you elaborate a little bit, Steve? Why didn't it matter? Why?
Well, because the Corps did what it wanted to do.
Okay.
One good example is when they were talking about how they were going to drain the city of New Orleans. There were two ways that were talked about using it. One was to have pumping stations at the Lake Pontchartrain and then drain the canals down. The other one was to create new canals. Another one was to keep it like it was, but only have floodgates and pumping stations for emergencies. And they were going to have a public hearing to get public input, and it's just to drive home the frustration that was coming to the commissioners. They had this great big old public input meeting, and they had 3 or 4 different plans, and they went through the whole process. And one of the Corps of Engineers guys told me, what we're going to do is the plan we want. So I said, why are we having a public hearing? He says, well, we got to have a public hearing.
To check off a checkbox. You have a public hearing.
They were going to do what they wanted to do. It didn't matter.
Wow.
Very, very, very frustrating. And then, of course, they had problems with 17th Street Canal Levee, didn't have appropriate right-of-way. So instead of going through the proper procedure of acquiring additional right-of-way from the adjacent landowners, they did things like they passed a rule and says you can't have anything within 15 feet of the toe of the levee.
Oh.
Well, what if you don't have right-of-way 15 feet from the toe of the levee? You've all of a sudden decided, I'm going to take right-of-way from this landowner and I'm not going to compensate him for it. And that's what they did because it didn't matter. They had to get it done quickly. And that was the whole issue. So no matter what the commissioner said, how we criticized, how we tried to improve it, where we found errors, none of that meant anything. They were going to do what they were going to do, no matter what. Matter
And
of fact,
this,
I,
and
I
this,
used to, I used to say that the flood authority was the authority that had no authority, and
I
it
remember I was there
it,
the first
it
time you said
really
that.
it really steamed me up that all of these things could be done. People knew how to do it. They certainly had the money to do it. There wasn't anything in right-of-way acquisition that was going to cost them anything expensive, but they didn't want to do it. And so they just drove away doing exactly what they want to do without regard for the authority. So
And you
all
were
this
there. You were there. You witnessed this. You didn't read
I
about
was
it. You didn't hear about it. You saw it.
I was sitting on the commission,
Hmm.
and right now I can tell you it doesn't matter who they appoint to that commission, as long as they're reasonably honest guys. Uh, they'll be able to perform the routine things that they're required to perform. You don't have to have experts on that commission because it doesn't matter what the experts say. The Corps of Engineers is going to do what the Corps of Engineers is going to do.
And Steve, if I may jump in here, everything you say is true. It may be a bit of surprise to a lot of the listeners, but in addition to what my guest just said, that there's also the whole issue that oh, I can't believe I lost my train of thought. Never mind.
That's all right. We'll catch that train
Yeah,
later.
we'll catch that later. But the what's in my mind, the most important time when the commissioners could have influenced the Corps and worked with them to build the protection properly was in the early years, like right after all the levees failed. In my mind, that was the most important time, the biggest moment for the brand new authorities created after Hurricane Katrina. But you're saying you were there and they were basically told, we'll take it under advisement. Isn't that
We're
your
gonna
words?
They're going to do what they're going to do.
Hmm.
One particular incident when they built a levee at the west return at the very west end of the levees. They had to create a drainage system to keep the water from the backyards of the homes that were there. So, did they come to the authority and say, "What are your recommendations?" No, they just designed something. Did they come with the design and say, "Well, here's the design. I want you to check it out"? At least they could have done that, right? No,
Right. I
they.
remember what my thought was. May I, Steve?
Yes, go ahead.
So in addition to what Mr. Stopinal just said, to what Steve just said, that the Corps is going to do what it wants to do, it's going to build what it wants to build. Okay, the system is now built. Now we're way down the road, and now it's just simply a matter of maintaining and operating that built system. Pretty much, there's a couple of things may need to be built, but it's 95% built. But here's the thing: the Army Corps of Engineers doesn't just build a $16 billion system and hand it over to the local levee districts and go, here you go. The Army Corps has specific instructions that the levee districts have to follow to the T. Or the Corps can give them a rating of unacceptable, and that's the worst thing that can happen. We could lose our insurance. I mean, no one would be able to get insurance, and that would be terrible. So
Every,
in a
every operation of that board is conducted under a manual that's printed by the Corps of Engineers, and you have
right,
to do what that manual says. Like I said,
right.
any reasonably intelligent person with goodwill can follow that instruction to a T. You don't have to be an expert to do it. You just have to be a moderately intelligent fellow. The other thing that got me was when the designs, we say, well, who's going to review the designs? The Corps Engineer. He says, no, we have reviews after it's built. I
Oh
kid you
wow.
not. After it's finished, they do a review. So I'm going back to that west return levy. The design of the system was so inefficient that the first heavy rain they had flooded I don't know, half a dozen homes, a dozen homes, 3 or 4 times in one year. Finally, I was able to get copies of the design of the drainage system. And the design of the drainage system looked like something that was done by an eighth grade school student. And he should have gotten an F. It was absolutely, it was, first of
Yeah,
all,
no offense to eighth graders.
yeah, well, I don't want to hurt eighth graders' feelings. I'm sorry. I should go to fourth grade. It used the wrong parameters. It used the wrong modeling system. And the modeling system they did use, they used improper factors in it. It was absolutely terrible. So terrible that I turned it in to the state board as a failure, engineering failure, because I wanted that engineer's license that designed that. Well, I was told that didn't matter because it was the Corps of Engineers, so he wasn't going to be held liable for it.
Oh, and that's another issue, but that's for another show.
That's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
But that same design, the Corps of Engineers had sent it to their professional reviewers to review the design of whoever that engineering, and I think it was done by an engineering intern. I don't think it was done by an engineer. They checked everything off on it as being fine. When the engineers on the board and the levee board's engineer looked at it, Taylor looked at it and said, wait, these parameters are all wrong. They're absolutely wrong. You can see it looking at it in the first place. It's glaring how bad it was, and yet these PhDs had signed off on it. And so that wound up in court. And after 20-something years, it was finally settled. And I don't know what the settlement was. But
it doesn't surprise me.
But it doesn't matter because it was the Corps of Engineers and they were doing what they wanted to do. And they didn't seek advice for people that knew better. They just went ahead and ran through their whole little system. It was incredibly frustrating.
I could see your frustration. I could see it loud and clear. And you were the first to speak up and say this. No one wanted to hear it because that vaunted levee board reform was supposed to restore confidence and supposed to make everything better. In my mind, what it really did is drew attention away from those incompetent Corps of Engineers that you called out yourself was one of the first things you said. In my mind, it drew attention away from the people who were at fault. It was not these local levee districts and certainly not these levee boards.
The Katrina flood was caused because the Corps of Engineers improperly designed an eye wall system, and it failed. And it failed way before its design heights were reached. It was a Corps of Engineer design failure that caused that levee collapse that flooded out those homes. I'm sorry, but that's just the facts. That's how it is.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I'd like to let our guests know that just 7 weeks after the flooding, the business community had their mind made up. They were going to do this levee board reform. 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, we didn't know what the cause of the levee breaches was. I mean, we now know what it was, and we found out years later. But 7 weeks after the flooding, the business community wanted to do this levee board reform. They blamed the levee districts and the levee board that governed the levee district. They blamed these local people, and it turned up that they were not at fault, but we wouldn't know this for years. In the meantime, in this environment of chaos, this levee board reform got passed. And at the time, it didn't. I looked at it and went, "Well, I guess it can't cause any harm."
Well, Sandy, if they would have just simply listened to, taken under advisement in a real way, the suggestions from the people that are on that board, there have been a lot of design changes. But right now, you have a levee system that's going to be very, very difficult to maintain.
Right.
It's going to be, I can't imagine what they're going to do when it comes time to raise the levees. It was built with a 50-year lifespan. Well, that's half gone. So you got 25 years left. What are they going to do? we have sections of the levee that are in the way of collapsing now in Verret because of the way the T wall is was designed and because of the way they filled around the top of the T wall to get a vehicle bypass on it. And you remember that incident where the T wall was falling over, and so you have all of these maintenance problems that were really the result of improper design.
And
And
it sounded like a good idea at the time. I didn't fight it, even though what worried me terribly, it was drawing attention away from the two culprits and blaming people who just weren't responsible. There was a Franciscan nun on the board in 2000.
yeah,
Okay. And I know that's anecdotal, but she's representative of all those good people on those boards. They were good people managing the system and doing,
and they were doing
doing their
precisely
jobs.
they were doing precisely what the Corps of Engineers manuals told them to do.
Right, right. And
They
by the
did,
way, they
they
do
did,
have, for those listeners out there unaware, there are staff engineers at these levee districts. I mean, there are, and these are paid staffers that are there year after year after year. They don't rotate through like board members. The board members, according to John Barry, who served as a commissioner, basically are money managers. They manage spending of money, they manage contracts. Because these levees, they manage about $70 million a year because these levees need to be maintained and it's very, very expensive. And now the price tag is much more like I've heard numbers as high as $1 billion to maintain these new levees.
well, I don't have any idea what it's going to take to maintain them because I haven't been on the board in some time, and I've retired my license. But it wouldn't surprise me, particularly with the design that is in place now was not done with a eye toward future improvements,
Hmm.
and that's been a real shortcoming. But yeah, the nun on the board was doing just as good as an engineer could have done in her place because no matter what suggestion they had in terms of engineering, it was not accepted.
It was not accepted, and they
You're,
had
you're,
and
you're
had
here
to,
to you're here to make sure that the grass gets mowed and report places where the levee sloughs off. That's your job.
and that's just the way it is.
That's
And
the way it is.
and
That's the way it is today.
and
So it really doesn't matter to have all these great engineering minds on the levee board. Where you want these engineering minds to be is in the design section,
exactly.
and
So
they
in
weren't
my
there.
mind, it's my understanding that New Orleans is the only levee board in the entire country. I mean, you've got levee districts all up and down the Mississippi River. You've got levees, and 62% of the American population lives by levees. New Orleans is the only one that hires experts to be on its levee boards. And we've done that. It was meaning. We
Mhm.
meant well, but as you said very loud and clear, it just doesn't matter.
Right, and these people. It's important to notice these people were not hired. These people worked pro bono.
Oh, yep. Hmm. That's
These
right.
experts worked pro, and these were high end guys. These were guys whose uh, consulting fees ran into the hundreds of dollars an hour, and they were doing it pro bono. And
Absolutely.
the frustration is that the system was not designed to accept their input.
Right,
Uh,
right.
you
And
you
and it's
weren't
federal. It's
you,
federal. You have to change federal law.
you weren't putting the experts in the right place.
Right.
Where the experts belonged was in the design section of the Corps of Engineers, not not in the local levy board where they just don't have any say in the matter.
Right. And so one of the ways that the flood the nominating committee for for these members who serve on the board, they've been insisting that they're doing a good job. They're doing a good job. And they may be, but my question to you, Steve, is how do you know if the nominating committee is doing a quote unquote good job? And not so much the nominating committee. I'm going to re-ask that question, Steve. Okay. How do you know if the levy authority is doing a quote unquote good job? How do you measure their work?
Well, the only thing you can look at is whether or not they're doing what the manuals say. Are
And how
they
do you do
cutting the
that,
grass?
Steve? How do you do
Well,
that?
you have somebody check, make sure that they're mowing the grass, make sure that they're reporting any slough offs that are on the levee. all the things that little manual talks about when a storm is brewing. Do they have the right people to go out and close the correct gates? Uh, that's the only way to check how they're doing their job.
But how do you check it?
Well, you got to have an inspector.
An inspector.
Yeah,
Okay. And who would that inspector work for?
well, they have to be for the governor.
Have to be for the governor. Okay,
Yeah,
so we'd have to create, but I think you see where I'm going with this. There isn't one. So the answer to your question, your answer to me is there isn't a way.
there isn't.
There
Well, yeah,
isn't.
there isn't a way to check it. That's
There
correct.
isn't a way. And we just so how can you go around saying we're doing a great job when there's no way to measure it? To my knowledge, Steve, there is one way. There is one way. The Army Corps of Engineers gives the levee districts a rating, an O&M rating every single year.
Oh, Sandy, that thing is such a bogus
Well,
rating.
it may be bogus, but it is a rating. Okay, it is, and it's the only
I
one that
remember,
I'm
I
aware
remember
of.
going, I remember going into one of my first meetings at the Flood Authority. It was in an old levee board office, and on the walls were all the plaques for the high ratings that the levee board
Excellent,
got, all
of
the way up to
excellent.
2004. They got
Right, right. I
gold
know. I've
star
seen them.
rating,
I've seen them. Okay.
and and it wasn't.
After,
Actually, it wasn't. It probably deserved a gold star rating because it wasn't their fault that the levees failed.
right, right. It wasn't. So they deserve their gold star rating.
I guess.
But now, and that's another thing. So people believe that people have this idea in their head that the pre-Katrina levee boards weren't paying attention. They were, first of all, they had to pay attention. They were paying attention, and they got grades of excellent from the Army Corps of Engineers. Since
It,
Hurricane Katrina, the Army Corps of Engineers has changed their rating system. Now you get a grade of either acceptable, minimally acceptable, or unacceptable. And in my understanding, which is interesting, I did a request under FOIA and got the grading that the Corps gave the new improved, gold plated levee board that we had that you served on, not meaning to be ugly or anything. And every single year, the Corps gave that shiny new levee board a grade of minimally acceptable.
well, that's probably right.
Yeah, it is. I got it, and
I
I
would think it's
well,
minimally acceptable. Yeah,
yeah, it was never unacceptable, but minimally acceptable,
minimally acceptable.
and it's been poo-pooed as well. It's a grade, but it doesn't mean anything. The Army Corps of Engineers is just trying to hedge their bets. It's just trying to CYA cover the behind.
Yeah, yeah.
And but my point is, regardless of whether it's a CYA, that's the only grade there is, and it's minimally acceptable. So
Minimally
here
acceptable.
we
That's
are.
it.
So if I may, Steve, can we talk just for a second, just for a moment about this all the brouhaha that has just been unleashed because the governor of Louisiana has decided he wants it the old way. He now wants to be the one to decide who serves on the levee board, like the old days before
Yeah,
Hurricane Katrina. I was invited for comment by the advocate, one of the new reporters over there who is now stepping into Mark Schlesing's shoes, or one of the many reporters filling his shoes. And he
yeah.
asked me about it, and I said, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the who selects the commissioners because by law they have to follow the Corps of Engineers instructions and they have to manage the money so it doesn't matter. Now, would if you ask me, I would rather have a gold ribbon, a blue, excuse me. If you ask me, I would rather have a blue ribbon committee select our commissioners, if you ask me. Okay. But it really doesn't matter. That's what I told the reporter. And he said, is there anyone else you can suggest I call? And I gave Alex Lubin your name, Steve. And how did that conversation go?
He
Do you
called me.
remember?
Yeah, he called me and he asked me about it, and I told him, well, it really doesn't matter as long as the commissioners appointed are reasonably honest and reasonably intelligent people. It doesn't matter because expertise doesn't come into play. It's everything is in the manuals. The levee's built. There's nothing to design. there's no engineering decisions to make, and so I guess that's why I didn't appear in the article he wrote.
And neither did I. So you're in good company, Steve.
I
We get
think so.
we get ignored because we're telling them something that they don't want to hear. And the bottom line is the advocate is clinging to that original narrative from 7 weeks after the flood and from when that levee board reform was passed, blaming local people for not telling the Corps what to do, and which I know is absurd. I've studied this for 20 years. Nobody tells the Army Corps of Engineers what to do.
Exactly right. Nobody, not even the president.
Not even the president.
Right.
And if
They are meant to be all themselves.
well, I there was one odd situation where the president did tell the Corps what to do, and they did. I don't know. We discussed this in an episode of the Slingshot from levees.org. Our new sworn-in president told the Corps of Engineers to release 2 billion gallons of water in California, in
Oh
Northern
yeah,
California.
for
And to
for,
my
for our
shock,
protection.
the
Yeah,
Corps complied.
yeah,
But that was the president.
yeah. Well, and of course, I spoke facetiously. What really, where the Corps really operates is when Congress tells them to do something
Right.
and gives them funds to do it, they're going to do it. And if Congress gives them a deadline, they're going to do it under that deadline, and everything else falls away. Uh, you know, you can build anything if you got enough money, and if you give the Corps enough money, they'll make the most biggest monstrosity you ever saw in your life. If you just give them the money, and they really go by what Congress what Congress authorizes, and essentially what the president says. That's what they do.
Well, my understanding in California, for some reason, the Army Corps complied. This was just days after the new president was sworn in, and they actually did release 2 billion, but they were initially supposed to release 5 billion. And I think the farmers in California were screaming blue murder. You're flooding out the farmland. You're releasing the water at the wrong time. Then finally, the Corps said okay, and they turned off the water. But I was shocked. That was the first time in my 20 years of studying the Army Corps that I'd ever seen the Corps actually follow a direct order, like on the spot. And
Yeah. Well,
it
I didn't
probably
I didn't get to witness that. I should have paid more closer attention to the news.
there was so
But
much going on in those
yeah,
days, those
but
chaotic
yeah.
days in January. But
I,
yeah,
now, of course, you realize that the levee system that you have in New Orleans now, which is what, $12 billion, 1.5, I forgot how much,
16.
16 billion, very neat. It's only designed to a level of a 100-year storm, which, as an engineer, is to me an insufficient design.
Hmm.
And to top that off, it was good enough for a 100-year storm 25 years ago.
Hmm.
Is it good enough for a 100-year storm today? I don't think so.
Doubtful. And I can add that that was a political decision. It wasn't an economic one. And
That's
the
right.
feeling was that everybody should get the same amount of protection. So St. Bernard Parish, which population was decimated, as you know, Steve, 'cause you're
Draws,
from
yeah.
there, they got 100-year protection, and so did the main polder, the main basin of New Orleans. That's where the Superdome is, with the
Yeah.
most people, property, and infrastructure. All got 100-year
100-year.
protection. And what that means for Saint Bernard, got 42 feet high levees, and in New Orleans got levees only a couple of feet higher.
Well,
Whereas for just maybe 3 more feet, the main basin of the city of New Orleans could have had 500-year protection.
but that wasn't what Congress told them to do.
Right. That's not what Congress
And
told them to do. Oh,
and
I know.
you got 100-year protection. There was 100-year protection in 2008, 2007. It's not 100-year protection now. And every year it goes down and down and down. And you're going to reach a point where either you're going to have to increase the protection or you're going to have to do something else to break up that storm surge. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the Corps of Engineers wasn't interested in doing
Mm-mm.
anything else to break
Mm-mm.
up. It wasn't in the orders they got from Congress. It wasn't in the bill. It wasn't in the money. They weren't interested in even looking at it. But there's a lot of engineers that have some very good ideas about things that can be done to reduce that surge, so you don't have to have that 23-foot high flood wall. That you can break the surge up long before it gets to populated areas.
Thank you for
But
correcting me, Steve. It
nobody,
wasn't a 42 high foot wall. It was a
it was
23
20.
foot high wall. Might as well be 42, but it's insanely high. It's ugly, and it's not it was political, not economic. And
That's
so
correct.
I have just one other thing. I'm going to hold. Oh, Steve, no, I'm doing a Zoom. I'm doing an important interview right now. Can you get? Okay, okay, all right. Okay, Landry, cut that out. Okay, you can move that.
I
Yeah,
think you
my
figured that.
husband just let the dog in, but that she'll be quiet in there. Oh, all right. One last thing, if we could talk about just for a minute, this talk about narratives that are stuck and is still around the drive-by levee inspections. Do you remember that, Steve? The
Oh, I remember they
drive-by
would do.
levee
Yeah,
inspections.
they would fly down the levee in a caravan. Yeah, yeah,
And then
and
they went to lunch
went to lunch, which was a big deal.
and but it turned up so people had got it in their head that the drive-by levee inspection, they thought that was the local levee districts doing their maintenance. They did it in a drive-by once a year.
No, that was
and
the Corps of Engineers.
and you stole my thunder, Steve, but I forgive you. I love you, and you can steal my thunder anytime. But yes, it was the Army Corps of Engineers inspecting the levees in a
Right.
couple of hours and going to lunch. Now, it was ceremonial. It wasn't the real inspection. It was a ceremony. It was a once a year social event that the Army Corps of Engineers got together with the local levees district. And they didn't go to Galatoire's. That was the rumor. They went to R&O's, which is a seafood joint on the lakefront. And you know what the grand cost per person was? $18.
Yeah, that
Okay.
sounds about right.
It was a
Yeah,
social event,
yeah.
but
All the
the
maintenance information came by from the people that were doing the grass cutting, the people
right.
that were operating the levee, and every time the grass got cut, reports would come in of this or that was needed, and they had staff people inspecting the levees every day. Somebody was looking at something on the levee. Those ride-by inspections, as you say, they were ceremonial. They were
They were
they were
ceremonial and they were red herring. They were unimportant.
Yes, yes. They were like the parade at the end of the war. It didn't mean
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. So you heard it here. All you listen out there, you heard it here from an expert who served. I don't know how you're going to get more expert than Stephen Estopinal, who was there and served on the commission, and also from yours truly, Sandy Rosenthal, who's been studying this issue for 20 years of her life. Those drive-by levee inspections were irrelevant
Yeah,
and a red herring. But so Steve, this has been I don't know if I would call it fun, but it's certainly been enlightening.
yeah,
And
oh yeah, and there's other things that I've forgotten that I could talk about. I'll think about them after we're finished and go, oh, I should have mentioned this or that. Well, yeah,
I'll just have to invite you back.
yeah, that'll probably be a good idea. It's just that that whole period of time in my life, there was an epiphany to me because growing up as a young engineer, I always had the Corps of Engineers and this on the hill as being the goal. And then when I got to run into what they actually did, I realized that it was just a simple, cumbersome bureaucracy that stifled the original thought, that rejected any kind of opinion that wasn't created there, and served themselves and not anybody else. And
Steve, do you
it's a
think the
hard thing to
Army Corps of Engineers, do you think the Army Corps of Engineers was that organization that you respected so well maybe 50 years ago?
Uh, I don't know. They may have been when they were first given the assignment. I'm sure that they were very good at it, but it developed. I was in the combat engineers when I was in the Army, and Lord, I know the Army does things rough ways, but they get them done. The Corps of Engineers was really a civilian bureaucracy. They would run the colonel out front, so everybody could see a respected military man. But the guys that were doing the stuff behind the scenes were long-term bureaucrats.
Gotcha.
It was hard to it was hard to break into that little club with new ideas, with better ways to do things, with maybe this ought to be the way to do it. Levees only became their mantra, and so if they had to build it higher, they had to build it bigger, but they just would not accept the idea of looking at other ways to protect populations from flooding.
So that was it must have been a bit of a downer for you when you realized things
Well,
weren't
it
as
was
you
it was
thought.
pretty rough, and I remember when I was criticizing the Corps greatly, and even back then I was pretty critical of them. I remember one colleague of mine commented, he said, "You'll never get a contract with the Corps of Engineers. You keep talking like that." And I said, "Well, I'm not interested in a contract with the Corps of Engineers. I respect my engineering work." So it was, yeah, it was a learning experience, and I'm
Interesting you
sure
say that because they couldn't shut me up because I didn't care if I didn't get work with the Army Corps of Engineers. But
well,
go on.
and it turned out I didn't either. And I didn't get it. Not only did I just didn't get it, but I didn't pursue it either. It was just such a bureaucracy.
Do you think more engineers would have spoken up had they not been worried about their businesses and their careers and paying the
Maybe
mortgage?
that perhaps, and being in private practice, and because of my surveying practice and my other private practice was so much involved with local economies, I wasn't worried about having a big overhead to feed.
Yeah,
So
you were fortunate.
yeah,
You,
well,
you
yeah, I was lucky all along.
There was a lot of work to be had after those levees broke. They broke in
Yeah,
50 different places. So it was a trough of work for anyone who wanted it, if you just kept your head down and didn't complain.
right.
And there are some people who did complain. I can't think of their names off right now because I didn't come prepared to speak about them, but I do have the names of several engineers who lost their jobs because they did speak up.
Because they
Luke
did
Aaron
speak.
Singh, I think, was one of
Yes,
them.
yes.
And Gordon, something Gordon, Gordon's first name or his last name, spoke up.
Hmm.
But it did not go well if you
No,
spoke up
no.
and get criticized.
Bureaucracy is an animal that's pretty hard to defeat.
Yes.
Uh, it's got a lot of heads and it has a lot of tentacles, and so it's hard to fight the bureaucracy.
But what I've learned when they do make a mistake, it's a big one.
Oh, well,
Steve,
and
you
they
remember
do.
that time Levy.org caught the Army Corps of Engineers sitting at their computers and leaving vicious comments
Yes.
on anonymous comments, and I figured out it was them by using their IP address, which for the listeners that don't know, that's basically like caller ID. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like
Yeah.
so.
Well, you
But
figure they were engineers, they would know that.
you
I'm
would
going to leave an
think
email to somebody, and of course, my IP address says the exact place on the planet Earth that
the
computer is.
exact place on this
Yes,
planet, exactly.
latitude, longitude, and
Oh,
elevation.
oh my gosh, it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and it's not illegal, but the Army Corps of Engineers is still embarrassed about it. That talk about
Yeah.
caught with your pants down. So, but Steve,
I
this has
hope they
been
I hope they improve their bureaucracy
they
because
have they have.
they get a lot of money and they do things that are very important. And if they can just fix that bureaucracy
Hmm.
and bring in people that have engineering ideas, engineering means that you think of special ways to do things that are very important. And if you get those kind of people in there, maybe it'll be a better place to work. I don't know.
Is that your final word, Steve? Or is there anything else you'd like to say? Because we're about run out of time. I
No,
think
no,
that was
that'll
a
be it.
I think that
That'll
was a
be it.
great ending. I thought it was perfect.
Okay. All right, Sandy.
You sure? You sure you don't want to add anything
I'm
else?
I'm I'm pretty much done. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah, this can be exhausting. No, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much, Sandy.
You're
And a
welcome.
pleasure seeing you again.
It's nice seeing you too. Stay with me. I'm just going to say goodbye to our listeners and stay with me for a
Okay.
moment, okay? So, thank you, the listeners, also for joining us today. I hope you liked this episode. I know I did. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and like this podcast, Beat the Big Guys, on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. Okay, stay with me.